for next week. Have we started recording, Nikita?
Yes, the recording have now started.
Got it. Okay, excellent. So thanks very much again, everyone, for being here. I'm really pleased to deliver this second workshop in the paper development workshop series. And if you'll bear with me, I will share my screen. Okay, hopefully everyone can read that. If the print gets a little small, I can turn it to slideshow view, but I like it better like this because then I can see if people raise their hand or have a question. As always, if anyone has a question, just interrupt me. I envision these to be quite informal sessions, and hopefully we will get some back and forth dialogue going on in terms of, in this context, what makes a good introduction. So without further ado, I will move on to our second slide, which is a review of workshop 1. For those of you who may have missed workshop 1, which was held a fortnight ago, I believe, there were 4 basic questions that we were tackling in that workshop. And if you missed it, that one, don't feel like you've missed out too much, because the real core of what we hope to do in this series starts today. The last session was essentially brainstorming paper ideas and thinking about what a new contribution to the literature means. What does that mean, new? I mean, technically everything we write is new because it's a unique configuration of words, isn't it? But in my experience as an editor, I feel that this is one of the hardest hurdles for submitting authors to overcome. And that's, are you making a novel, an original, or an exciting contribution to the literature? And it's really gotten to quite ridiculous proportions at this stage. I've seen papers rejected because, in the words of the editor or the reviewers, the paper only makes an incremental contribution. So in other words, they're admitting that the paper makes a contribution. It does say something new, but it's only incremental. It's not revolutionary and it's not exciting. I think there's a bit of hypocrisy surrounding that because, again, as an editor, I feel like I'm looking at the same paper over and over and over again. I feel like we're, especially in my field, in human resource management, I don't want to pass judgment on your fields, but in my field, I feel like we're rehashing the same debates over and over again, but using a different set of words. Do we really need 50,000 papers showing that training improves job satisfaction, right? We know this pretty well. It doesn't seem to add much value. Maybe there are some optimization questions in there. What kind of training or how much training or what types of people are more receptive to training. But generally speaking, I think we do a pretty poor job in terms of this new contribution to the literature. But to the extent that you can identify something that really hasn't been done before, and there are a few research questions out there that will address that, you are really significantly bolstering your chances of success in peer review. And as I said in the last session, it's not easy as an early career researcher to know what a new contribution is because you don't have that wide and comprehensive understanding of the literature. And you may come up with ideas that you think are fascinating and novel, and you put them down in paper, and then through the peer review process, you found out that someone else had already come up with that fascinating and novel idea before you. So it felt new to you, but I think the important point I'm making here is it doesn't matter how you feel about it. It matters whether objectively it is a new contribution. The only way to do that is to read the literature, find out what's out there. And that's why I encourage, especially early career researchers, to ad hoc review as much as they can and potentially eventually join an editorial board, because that's that's what really forces you to get out there and read and figure out what we know and what we don't know. And by figuring out what we don't know, you can calibrate your research questions so that you are making this new contribution. We also spent some time in the last workshop looking at sources for identifying secondary data sets. These are secondary data sets that are both quantitative and qualitative. Believe it or not, there is a lot of untapped qualitative data out there, transcripts that go on, pages and pages and pages that haven't been perhaps analyzed in the way that you would like to analyze them. So I don't mean for this series to exclude the qualitative people. They are just as welcome as the quantitative people. And we talked a bit about which journals to target. And I said in the last session, realistically, for this workshop series, we should be ideally trying to create a good solid A or Q1 paper. The reason I don't recommend a star paper for this series is that we only have 8 months left of this year. 8 months is more than enough time to write a good solid A paper, a good solid Q1, but it's not nearly, not even close to enough time to write an A star paper. A star papers are in a level of their own. And we quantify that by saying that an A paper is worth 1 and an A star paper is worth 3. Does that mean that an A star paper takes three times the amount of time as an A paper? I would say it's probably even more than that. So let's, for the purposes of this series, focus on all of us creating a good A paper by the end of this year. And I asked you to think of some tight research questions that can be used to anchor your paper. And I just want to pause here before I move forward just to clarify something. And that's that I encourage everyone to attend these sessions, regardless of whether you're writing a paper alongside the workshop. So I'm actually doing that. I'm taking my workshop as a timeline for a paper that I'll be writing this year. And I may be referencing it from time to time throughout this workshop series, certainly today. But I don't want to exclude anyone who feels that they don't have the time to meet particular deadlines. And I certainly want to make sure that I'm not going to be assigning any homework or reviewing whether or not you've done this. This is just for your benefit. And if you want to write a paper in conjunction with this, you're more than welcome to. That would be very much encouraged. But I would rather you to attend and not write a paper just to get the insight than to not attend because you feel like you have to write a paper, if you know what I mean. So any questions on workshop 1 before I move into the meat of this workshop? Oh, good. Okay. So let's start out with the first question I want to ask. What are the hallmarks of a good introduction section of a paper? And I've come up with, I think, 4 key points here that are worth mentioning. The first point I want to emphasize is that an introduction is short. What does that mean, short? I would say any introduction longer than 3 pages is too long. And ideally, an introduction should be about 2 pages. Roughly 4 paragraphs, maybe 5 paragraphs, potentially 6 paragraphs. You have to be a little bit flexible about these things. I don't mean to impose a set of, rigid guidelines here that you must follow, but generally speaking, I think shorter introductions are better. And when I say short, I'm really talking approximately 2 pages, double spaced, 12-point font Times New Roman. There is some variability associated with this point, and that's that there are certain disciplines, and I would say psychology is one of them. I've published in a few psychology journals that aren't organizational psychology, but mainstream psychology. And they only have 4 sections for a paper. So they'll have an introduction in which they subsum the literature review, and then they have a method section, and then they have a result section and a discussion and conclusion section. So in psychology, if you're writing for a psychology paper, your introduction might be somewhat longer because you're including the review of the literature and maybe even some hypotheses in the introduction. But for most of us in the management space, in the international business space, HRM space, entrepreneurship space, you will see a separate literature review, which we're going to talk about uh, at the next workshop. And for your introduction, you want to have it pretty short, about 2 pages. So part and parcel of making your introduction short is making sure that the writing is parsimonious. What does that mean, parsimonious? Parsimonious means that you are saying as much as you possibly can in absolutely as few words as possible. In other words, the principle should be to keep things concise, to keep things succinct, to keep things simple rather than to draw out and extend things. And I think this is a really, I don't know if this is so much an introduction tip as it is a general writing tip, because I feel like this tip applies to all sections. This applies to your literature review, your methods, your results, and your discussion and conclusion. We are unfortunately trained in the large part at PhD level to come to the conclusion that the best writing is the most sophisticated, the most complex writing. And that is absolutely false. Unless you're a postmodernist, and I certainly would make space for those types of scholars. If you look at writers like Foucault and Derrida, the writing is almost impenetrable, and it's hard to understand what they're actually saying. Someone like myself, I don't have much appreciation for that type of academic research. That's not to say that it has no worth, because certainly it has worth for certain groups within academia. But generally speaking, if you want to get something published in a mainstream journal, not one of the postmodern or post-structuralist journals, simple writing is the key. Say as much as you can in as few words as possible. That is so important that I'll say it again. Say as much as you possibly can in as few words as possible. Because, I think although it's frustrating that we have these word limitations when we submit articles, I think it actually helps us. And it's not just a lesson or a principle for us, it's a principle for our students as well. That's why we have word limits for our students. When they enter the workforce, your boss isn't going to have the patience to sit there and listen to someone speak for 15 minutes when they could have said what they wanted to say in 5 minutes. Right? So it's just an important skill. So I would urge you, this is actually kind of good news for people who might not be as confident in their writing style, because they might be aiming to mimic that sort of, Foucauldian writing style. You don't have to, and not only do you not have to, you shouldn't. Plain, simple, short sentences, clear words are the best way forward. Okay. Third point, hallmarks of a good introduction. It communicates why the research matters. And I think this is a really crucial element of an introduction. The reader's going to say, who cares? Now, obviously, you care. You wrote the paper, so clearly you care. But the fact that you care doesn't mean that other people will care necessarily. You have to be explicit, and you have to bring them along for the ride and show them why this research matters, what's important about it. Because again, you're taking that for granted. You wrote the paper, but taking it for granted really makes a risk that other people won't see the connections that you're making. So you need to make those connections explicit and say, look, this paper is important because ... And the last hallmark of a good introduction session is that it communicates how the paper makes an original contribution to the research. Now, you don't have to do this at length. Get back to the principle of parsimony that I just talked about. The place where you do this at length is in the literature review, but you do want to have a paragraph or maybe two at the absolute most that articulates, generally speaking, to which literature, to which debates you are making a contribution. And again, making that explicit to the reader, because again, it may be explicit to you. You may see in your mind, of course, this is a brilliant contribution, but unless you make that clear to the reviewers and the editor, you're running the risk of them not making that connection of where the contribution actually is. So bear in mind these four general principles when writing an introduction. Make it count. The introduction is absolutely crucial. Let's start with a few facts. Facts that we may not want to face, but facts that we can't deny. Very, very few people will ever read your paper from top to bottom. Sometimes I feel like I don't even read my papers from top to bottom. I know I had to have because I wrote them, but it just feels like we're putting in all this work, you're putting in all this effort, and maybe the reviewers will read it. Generally speaking, they read it from top to bottom. That can't be guaranteed, by the way. Same with the editors. We assume that the editors are reading it from top to bottom, but we don't know that for sure because some editors just skim it and push it out to the reviewers. And then once a paper gets published, it pretty much remains dormant. I can't remember the statistic. I think it was some ridiculous statistic like 50 or 60% of social science papers never get cited. Can you imagine that? The only person in my life that I know ever read my papers from top to bottom was my mom. And I don't think anyone else, at least verifiably, has read everything that I've ever written. So fact number one, few people are going to read your paper. And fact number two, to the extent that people are going to read your paper, it's typically going to start with and end with the abstract, which is your summary of what the paper's about. But here's the next important point is that if someone's going to read beyond the abstract, and again, that's not going to be very often, but when it happens, the second most read section is the introduction. So this is your opportunity to set the hook. This is your opportunity to draw them in. If they start reading through your introduction, this is where you can get them excited. This is where you can encourage them to continue reading the rest of the paper. Because the fact of the matter is, first impressions count, and that's what an introduction is. It's your first impression. And we all know that first impressions count based on our own experience with marking students' essays. I don't know about you, but for me, in about 80% of cases, I can usually anticipate what the final grade of an essay will be just after the first couple pages. You see a sort of consistency in writing style across. Now, there are obviously uh, exceptions to that. Sometimes an essay will get considerably better as it goes or considerably worse, and obviously you would move up and down the grades. But the same kind of thing happens with reviewers. The first impression they get is what they read in the introduction. And to the extent that it's exciting and well written and tightly constructed, you're much more likely to start that review off on a positive footing as opposed to a poor introduction, which will automatically start them off on a negative footing. So I think this is a roundabout way of saying if you're going to put particular effort into any section of your paper, it should go into your introduction because I would say it is the most important section in terms of, again, setting the hook. We've talked a bit about what to include, what are the hallmarks of a good introduction. Now let's talk about what to avoid in an introduction. So this is a bit of two sides of the same coin, but I think there's some more insight here than just two sides of the same coin. More than 3 pages, forget about it. Right? You don't want to have more than 3 pages, with the exception of, again, certain disciplines do allow for longer introductions. But generally speaking, the shorter the better. The more concise, the better. The more succinct, the better. Following on from that first point is this isn't a place for a comprehensive review of the literature, right? We're not here to draw out what the key debates are at length and articulate exactly where our contribution is made and where it's not made. We're sort of setting the scene and we're hinting towards the contribution, but we're not expanding or elaborating on the contribution, right? This isn't a place for a full scale comprehensive literature review. Is your introduction boring? Is it unexciting? Is it uninspiring? Forget about it. I put an asterisk or three asterisks, in fact, next to this point, because I think that this is one of the weaknesses of the peer review system. I think we do let too many boring, unexciting, and uninspiring papers through the system. And I've seen this so many times before. A paper may be technically very sophisticated. The methods might be esoteric or quite unique. And as a result, the paper gets accepted when in fact what it's saying isn't all that exciting, isn't all that inspiring. But having said that, uh, again, to the extent that you can make your introduction exciting, to the extent that you can make your introduction inspiring, this gets back to the point of demonstrating that your paper matters, then you're heading in the right direction. But even if you get bored about it or unexcited or uninspired about the topic, then I think that's probably a pretty good indication that it is by definition boring, unexciting, and uninspiring, and maybe it's worth abandoning this project for another one. Another really important point in terms of what to avoid in the introduction is spelling and grammar mistakes, right? Huge, huge error. Because again, this is about first impressions and your first impressions count. Go back to the example of how we mark student essays. If we see an introduction littered with grammatical mistakes and with spelling errors, that tells us that there was a certain degree of carelessness that was put into this paper. And the same applies to you. The same applies to me. If we have spelling mistakes, if we have grammatical errors in our introduction, this is starting the reviewer and the editor off on the wrong foot, right? You might assume, oh, well, these will be caught later in the peer review process. There's a copy editor and the copy editor is going to fix all these mistakes. That is a catastrophic assumption. The copy editor may pick up mistakes, but the idea is that if you want to get your foot in the door in the first instance, right? If you want to get your paper under review, the editor is going to read through it, sometimes skim through it. And if your first impression is one of carelessness, then more likely than not, this paper is going in the desk reject pile. And it's not terribly onerous to check your spelling and grammar. There are spell checks on Word that should pick up spelling mistakes. there are there is a grammar function in Word that identifies potentially grammatically incorrect terminology. I find this quite annoying because sometimes it identifies things that are grammatically incorrect that actually are correct. But nevertheless, it's worth looking into it. And if you are concerned about your grammar, in addition to having a colleague or a friend or a mentor proofread what you've written, there are some programs like Grammarly that will assist you in making sure that your grammar is looking okay. But remember this, first impressions, right? This is the first thing people read. It counts. Make it look good. Should I report the results in the introduction? And I've seen this done both ways. Sometimes I've seen people report the results, this study finds that, dot, 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 dot. And other times I find it more ambiguous. I think the advice I would give here is that, particularly if you're doing deductive quantitative research, I think it's bad form to report the results in the introduction. They already will have been reported in your abstract anyway. Your abstract, by definition, requires that you say what the key findings of the paper are. But from the introduction to the discussion and conclusion section, especially if you're following deductive research, you want to make this look like it's unfolding sequentially, right? So you're not jumping to conclusions before your data have actually been collected and analyzed. I understand there might be some differences there with qualitative research, but I would say that at least in quantitative research, avoid including a sentence in the introduction that says, this study finds that, or we found that, etc. Okay, so at this stage, I'm transitioning into what I consider to be the core of this workshop. But before I do that, I just want to ask, and I'll stop sharing and see if there's anyone here who has any questions that they'd like to ask as yet about anything I've said so far. Did anything jar you? Were you disturbed, enlightened? Anything at all that you want to comment on before I go into the actual structure of an introduction? Instead of reporting findings, a few lines for theoretical contributions at the end of the introduction. Yes. So we've got, sorry, I didn't see actually there've been quite a few comments. Avoid having a paragraph. The rest of the paper is organized. That I think is, yeah, it's a debatable one because I've seen editors say, no, you need to have an outline paragraph at the end, but that's certainly a valid recommendation. That's a good point. Fuming tend to avoid this paragraph, but I've been requested several times by the editor to put it in the guide. Yeah, this is what I'm saying is I think I agree with you too. I think it's not a good use of time or value, and we'll get to this because I have this in the presentation. But even though we think it's not a good use of time, editors are looking for this. So I've included it in terms of if you want to include this, this is what that paragraph should look like. But I agree, it does seem rather repetitive. Bear in mind that what we're dealing with here is a game. This whole publication thing is just a game. Uh, and we're lucky if the game that we play has impact, has some kind of effect, some kind of change on society, on organizations, on individuals. But generally speaking, what we're doing is we're conforming to the requirements of what has been described as good research. And it's not entirely clear that the requirements of what is considered good research is good research, right? So, yeah, thank you very much. All clear, all clear. So I will continue then, if you'll allow me to share my screen. Okay. So speaking in terms of the structure of an introduction, it consists of 4 chunks. And I say chunks rather than paragraphs because sometimes you can write out all 4 chunks across 4 paragraphs, but sometimes a particular chunk might require a paragraph or 2. See what I mean? So when I say chunk, I mean kind of like an element of an introduction. So 4 chunks, and we've already discussed this, the last chunk, which is essentially the outline of the paper, you may or may not want to include, but again, editors are looking for this kind of thing for whatever reason. So we'll start with chunk 1. This is essentially your first paragraph, the absolute opening of your paper. The most important paragraph, because again, this is where you set expectations for the rest of the paper. So it's really important to get this right. Your first chunk, which can be a paragraph or 2 paragraphs, answers the following questions. Number 1, what's the big picture? You don't want to start out with the granular detail and move into the broad. You want to start out with the broad and move down into the granular. So what is your paper actually about? What are you researching? Take a minute to think about that question. And hopefully, again, you'll have a paper in mind that you're working on in relation to this workshop. Take a minute just to think about, in a few words, what your paper is about. What are you trying to say? What academic debate or set of debates does it engage with? I say set of debates tentatively because I think ideally you want to have one key contribution. You might have secondary contributions to other literatures, but if you try and claim that your paper is making a contribution to this field and that field and the other field and across the social sciences and the humanities and has implications for the natural sciences and physics, you're spreading yourself too thin. So really what you want to do is ask yourself, what are the key academic debates going on in my field? What are people talking about? And how does what I'm writing about fit into those debates? And how do you know what the debates are? Well, again, like I said before, you have to read. You have to read the journals, you have to read the literature, you have to review papers, and you have to get a feel for what people are talking about. And only on the basis of that knowledge of what the key academic debates are, then you can signpost to people in this first paragraph where your paper contributes to those debates. Right? So what is your paper about? What are you trying to achieve here? Are there any crucial definitions as a editor? I see this as a common set of suggestions from reviewers is that they will say, well, you've introduced your topic, but you haven't actually set your definitions until, the method section or until late in the literature review. If you have definitions that need to be made, they should be made, hopefully, no more than a few of them early on in the paper. So what are the crucial definitions? What do we mean by the terms that we're using? What are the parameters of your research? And by parameters, I mean what topics are included, and I think this is important as well, what topics are excluded, right? So saying what topics are included is necessary, but not sufficient. You need to explicitly spell out, this is what this paper is about, and this is what this paper is not about. So that you can say, okay, this may be interesting, but it's not my focus. And lastly, are there any important caveats that are needed in your paper? Because you're going to be essentially summarizing your argument in this first paragraph or this first and second paragraph. You're summarizing your argument, but no matter what argument you put forward, there's going to be someone somewhere, probably a reviewer, who challenges you on the argument or on the assumptions of that argument or on the assumptions underlying it. And so what you want to do is you want to preempt any potential criticism of your argument here, again, very briefly. And often that's done by specifying what the inclusion and exclusion criteria are in terms of the research questions. Because someone's going to say, oh, well, how come you didn't do about this? Or how come you didn't do that? Or how come you didn't use this theory or that theory or this method or that method? And if you're explicitly recognizing the existence of these methods, but also explicitly saying, yes, these may be interesting, but they're not what I'm concerned about here, you're setting parameters in the way that will, I don't know, almost corral the reviewers. Like those sheepdogs that kind of run around the flocks of sheep and direct them in certain directions. That's what you're trying to do when I say setting the parameters of your research and adding the particular caveats that you think are needed to preempt the reviewer's criticism of you. Okay. So that's what I think the first chunk of your introduction should look like. And when I say chunk, I mean the first paragraph or two. Now, just to let you know, I'm not going to do this in every workshop because it could get a bit onerous and tedious. But I think given the fact that introductions are very short, I'm just going to walk you through the introduction of the paper that I'm doing for this paragraph and perhaps pull out some insight here in terms of what I just said, right? So this is what I've written. There are actually two paragraphs to this first chunk, and this is the first paragraph. So I start out by saying human resource managed decision making is on the precipice of a digital revolution. Bam, set the hook. A revolution, right? What could be more exciting than a revolution? The sudden dramatic rise of algorithmic HRM, right? So I've set, this is the context of this paper. We're going to be looking at this concept of algorithmic HRM. I add my definition here because some people might not know what the definition of algorithmic HRM is. Defined as the strategic use of data and machine learning to optimize HR decision making, has introduced almost superhuman capabilities to otherwise fallible HR managers, enabling them to predict future behaviors with unprecedented speed and accuracy. Superhuman, that's cool. You know, it's like Superman, right? It's like a superhero. Set the hook. This small but very quickly growing literature gyrates, perhaps not surprisingly, around the relationship between HR analytics and value creation, where machine learning, defined as a class of supervised and unsupervised statistical techniques that are used to predict an outcome or a set of outcomes, directly and positively contributes to individual and organizational performance. So I start out by saying, when most people think of machine learning, they think of the ways in which it can be used to improve organizational performance. The emphasis on this value creation is very well and makes sense in light of, I can't read the rest because this is in the way. In light of the high performance nature of HRM, but it is not the primary focus of this study. So here I'm setting the parameters. Remember what I was talking about, setting the parameters. So I recognize that there's this huge literature on how machine learning can be used to improve performance, but that's not what I'm doing here. Instead, the aim of this research project is to investigate whether or the extent to which algorithmic HRM can be employed to predict suicidal ideation among employees, right? So there's my, I'll start to share again if I can you see it or has it disappeared for you? Can you see the PowerPoint slide?
Yes, we can, Andrew.
Oh,
Yes.
okay,
Yes.
yeah, good. Okay, so that's paragraph one. And then the second paragraph is a bit of a caveat. So remember I said you should put caveats in there because I'm looking at that first paragraph. I'm saying, okay, I know what a reviewer is going to say. A reviewer is going to say, okay, you're saying that you're interested in using machine learning for purposes of predicting employee health outcomes and not for purposes of predicting performance, which is what I just said. But they're going to say, but there's clearly a relationship between health outcomes and performance. So I'm addressing the reviewer now in this second paragraph of the first chunk, preempting that particular criticism. So I say in the second paragraph of this first chunk, the prediction of suicidal ideation within the workforce is not, of course, fully divorced from individual and organizational performance. Got to recognize that. The creation of occupational health and safety climate is as good for productivity as it is for employee well-being, but the theoretical approach to algorithmic HRM taken in this paper is not concerned with performance per se, neither individual nor organizational, even insofar as value creation might be a byproduct of HR algorithms. The focus is instead on the dignity of the employee and the moral and legal obligations that HR has to prevent suicide. It suffices to say that prevention of suicide in itself has value above and beyond the profit margin. Okay, so that's the first chunk. I've introduced my definitions. I've kept it succinct. I've briefly indicated, where the debates are. I've established the parameters. This is what I'm looking at, and this is what I'm not looking at, right? Okay. Second chunk of your introduction. Who cares? Why does any of this matter to you or to anyone? What is it exactly that makes your research important? And I found that when you're answering this question, the use of descriptive statistics can be quite useful here in terms of convincing people why there is magnitude to what you've decided to research and write. Right? So this is the second or third paragraph, depending on how many paragraphs are in your first chunk of your introduction. And I would urge everyone to start this paragraph of this second chunk of an introduction with, this research is important because ... Right? Again, you may think it's important, and maybe other people think it's important as well, but some people might not see the importance, and that's why you have to make the importance explicit in this second chunk of your introduction. The research is important because of the incalculable damage wrought by suicide. The World Health Organization estimates that more than 700,000 people die by their own hand every year. Many victims are of working age. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration estimates that in the United States, 5.3 million people have thought about killing themselves, with around half of those reporting an attempt, right? So I'm giving some statistics here to say, it's not just me who thinks this is important. It is objectively important because of these data, these descriptive statistics. The COVID-19 pandemic has slightly exacerbated suicidal ideation, with one study estimating an increase of up to 145%. And the effects of suicide reverberate across the social fabric. So this isn't just about an individual committing suicide, it's about the effect of suicide on the survivors, with Jordan reporting that a large proportion of the bereaved will suffer significant impairment in both life and work. In short, to be touched by suicide is catastrophic, hence this research, right? So it's important, it matters, and here are the statistics to demonstrate, to prove to you that it matters. Without these statistics, people might, oh yeah, it seems kind of important, but I'm not sure what the magnitude of the problem is. No, you need to show people the magnitude of the problem in this paragraph. Third chunk of the introduction. Could be your third paragraph or your third or fourth paragraph, depending on how you look at it. What is the primary theoretical contribution of your research? Right? What is the gap, or the more commonly used sophisticated term, so to speak, is the lacuna? What is the lacuna that you're filling? How are you adding value to a key debate in your field? What's new here, right? This is where you get into that question of the contribution of your paper, and where you show that it's not just an incremental contribution, you're really pushing your literature forward in a way that is exciting. You're pushing your literature forward in a way that is original and inspiring. And lastly, are there any secondary contributions? Remember, I said you might be able to make contributions to multiple literatures, but you really should focus on one primary contribution in particular. And if there are secondary contributions, you can add to this paragraph. So this is the paragraph for chunk 3 in the paper that I'm writing with this workshop series. And I'm explicit at the very beginning, very first sentence. The primary theoretical contribution of the present study is the emerging literature on algorithmic HRM. Right, I've already sort of hinted to that at the beginning, that this is the space, this is the geographical intellectual space in which I'm making a contribution. These studies discuss the importance of machine learning, but very few do machine learning in practice, right? So I'm showing that there's a difference here, right? A lot of people might write about machine learning, but they don't actually do it, whereas this paper actually does it. The present study, in contrast, builds an actionable multi-layer perceptron, a form of artificial neural network using real employee data, thus enabling HR practitioners to adopt the algorithm. Moreover, as already discussed, whereas most extant studies in algorithmic HRM focus on how people and analytics create value, present study is framed primarily around occupational health and safety. Secondary theoretical contributions can be ascribed to the extant clinical, occupational, and epidemiological research on suicide prevention, although it's worth noting that the analytics tool presented in this paper is not designed for diagnostic purposes. So I put that in there as a qualification, a caveat, because I know some reviewer is going to say, oh, yeah, you think you're making a contribution to the psychology of suicide, but this isn't a diagnostic tool. I'm recognizing that that's what they're going to say. So a lot of writing a paper is really thinking like a reviewer and preempting those types of critiques before they can raise their head. Okay. The last chunk, this is one that we talked about just before I broke into this second part of the session, is the outline of the rest of the paper. Again, I'm with Fuming and Yuli. I think this is wasted because it's not exactly necessary. It's repetitive. But for whatever reason, editors are really looking for this kind of thing, and so are reviewers. It can be very short. It can be very succinct. This is what I'm doing. In the next section, I'm doing this. After that, I'm doing that. And then the paper's concluding with this. So just very briefly, this is the last paragraph of the introduction that I've written for today. In the next section, literature surrounding work-related predictors of suicidal ideation are distilled into an overarching framework. After that, the research methods by which the algorithm was developed are described. The predictive algorithm is then presented using real-world data and subsequently optimized. So this is the sort of results section. The paper draws to a close with the discussion of the tool and some directions for future research. Okay. So those are the 4 chunks. We have about 10 minutes. Let me just sum up here. Remember to set the hook. That's what you're doing with your introduction. Draw people in, bring them along for the ride, show them that this is original, show them that this is exciting, inspire them. Don't use the big words. Remember, simplicity is key. Simple sentences, simple words. Follow the formula of the 4 chunks that I've just described to you, right? If you sort of fill in the blank, it's kind of like, you ever did those Mad Libs when you were young? You do the Mad Libs. I don't know if people know what that is, but I did them when I was young in America. They tell you exactly what to write. It's like, you need to put a verb here. You need to put an adjective here. The same thing with this introduction. If you follow these 4 chunks and write up your introduction accordingly, you're heading in the right direction. Don't ramble. Don't go on and on. Keep it succinct. Keep it parsimonious. Keep it short. Ask a mentor or a colleague to read it before you continue writing up the literature review, and make sure you use the spell check and the grammar check. So your mission, should you choose to accept it, of course you don't have to, we have the next workshop in a week's time. I think a week is enough time to write an introduction, bearing in mind that an introduction is just 2 pages. It's just 4, 5 paragraphs, 6 paragraphs at the absolute most. Again, you don't have to show me the introduction or share the introduction at the next session. This is just a deadline for you that you can choose to impose upon yourself or you can ignore. But I think, if we want to reach the point where by December we all have a paper to submit, a week is enough time to write an introduction. So between now and the next workshop, which is in 1 week today, that is April 29th, where I'll be talking about writing a theory/literature review section, write up your introduction according to the principles or guidance that we've talked about here. And remember, it doesn't have to be perfect. Okay, that's that. I will turn my screen share off and ask, are there any questions that anyone has at this stage that you'd like to ask? Maria.
Thank you, Andrew. That was amazing. I really enjoy seeing the systematic way to write a proper introduction. In the past, I have been attending similar workshops, and one of the advices was to write the introduction at the end of the paper. So I just would like to know what's best, if writing the introduction at the beginning or at the end.
I don't think there's any best when it comes to that question. What I can say definitively, in my view, is that you should always write your abstract at the end. I never write my abstract at the beginning. I write the paper first, and then when I know what the results are, then I can write the abstract. Personally, I find the introduction to be most helpful as the first thing that I write because it signposts what I need to do. And it makes it really explicit. It keeps me on track. You set the stage and then the rest of the sections fall in line. But I'm not going to say that it has to be that way. Maybe different writing styles work with different people. But for my part, I find that, yes, I find that writing the introduction first helps, again, set the parameters of what you're trying to do.
Yep. Thank you.
Yep. Anyone else? Challenge accepted. That's the spirit, Hardik. That's the spirit.
Do what edit wants.
Well, that's the best advice ever, isn't it?
I had a one paper before. I try to keep like an introduction of 2.5 pages. In the end, the editor asked me to write more. So I ended up with 5 pages. I didn't like it, but I had to.
Well, that's the basic principle here, isn't it? Is in the end, no matter what I say is irrelevant if your editor or reviewers tell you something different. This is, I think, a model for what reviewers are looking for what editors are looking for. But every reviewer and every editor is different. And in the end, whatever they suggest, you should fall in line with.
Yeah,
Not necessarily.
Yeah, but for sure that if it start with a first submission with 5 pages, you're likely to get it rejected.
Yes, yes, exactly. Yes. Anything else?
Two and a half pages, double spaced, font size of 12, not single space.
Yes.
Single space is just a bit too much.
So Yuli says she's in the library and she can't really speak, but she has a reviewer telling her, "You've got me at the first sentence." Doesn't that say that's like a powerful comment there? She set the hook. So well done, Yuli.
One of the ways I learned from one of the leading scholars, he started with a question, very sharp question, the first sentence.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, it could be your research question.
Like Mark Heat. He is very sharp, very provocative. Bam, bam, bang. It's like shooting.
Yes. Yes. Yes, it is. It is really your golden opportunity to draw them in and to show them that this is a spectacular demonstration of research. And if you're not inspiring in this section, you're really doing your chances of success a lot of damage. Again, if you have to put extra special attention to any section in your paper, it should be this section. Anything else? We have about 3 minutes left. I might be able to take one more burning question. Oh, I see Catherine is disheartened by the undeniable reality that very little of what we write is actually read. Yes, I am too. That is a hard pill to swallow when you're an academic because we put so much time and so much effort into these papers, years sometimes. And to know for a fact while we're doing it that very few people are going to read it, yes, it can be a bit distressing. But you got to keep on keeping on and do the work and just cross your fingers and hope that maybe your paper is one of the papers that really does lead to impact someday and really does change society for the good. And I think that's really what we're about, here at RMIT, the emphasis on the kind of research that we do is based on answering research questions that will improve the world as it is today. So let's keep doing that hard work, and I will thank you all kindly for sparing me an hour on your Fridays. I know Fridays are precious research times, but hopefully the insight that you've gotten here will help you either write your next introduction or help you revise the introduction that you're currently working on. And as I said, you've got a good week now to work on your introduction, either revising one that you've already written or writing a new one. And I will look forward to seeing you next week, where we will be talking about how to write a good theory and literature review section. So thank you very much, everyone. I wish you a superb, fantastic, outstanding long weekend, and take it easy, and we'll see you soon. Bye, everyone.
Yeah.
Thanks, Andrew. I'll be stop recording now.
Thanks. And if you could send me a copy of this, Nikita, that would be great.
Yep. Yeah, no problem. All right.
Thanks.
Thank you.